Well, that's very difficult to say. I've got many pictures in over 60 years. So, but I think one of the favorite one is of Nelson Mandela in his cell. It's of course my favorite, but it's also a favorite picture in general. It was declared one of the best, most important of 50 photographs taken in the 20th century. Mm-hmm. But I think it was a very deep moment when Mandela was standing in the cell. He spent 17 years in that cell, and he was looking out of the window, and I asked him to stand in a certain way, and I got time to take a few frames, pictures, and he suddenly, his face sort of totally relaxed. And I thought that 17 years went through his head. There was a sort of total silence, and there was an atmosphere, certain moments. And so then when he was finished, I said, "Now, thank you very much." He turned around and he sort of smiled. But it was a different smile. Normally you can see someone, he has big smiles, but this was a sort of coming out of deep thoughts, a smile, and coming back into the world. Yeah, that's one of my favorite pictures. Well, I think that Mandela, for me, was maybe the most important person in South Africa, maybe in the 20th century. He was very instrumental, and so that the changeover that took place, where the apartheid government gave in, and it was given over, the freedom was given over to the African people, and the anti-apartheid parties were unbanned and so on. That was all his effort. I think he was very instrumental. That at that moment there wasn't any extreme violence. There wasn't any. It wasn't a violent. It doesn't turn into a violent revolution. Most of the time I used Leica, and in the earlier days I used sometimes called the Rolleiflex, which was a medium-size camera. But I experimented with different cameras from time to time. Sometimes, because I used a lot of color ones, I used the reflex camera, but generally I always stuck to the Leica M cameras. I don't know if you know the history of Leica. It was invented somewhere around the early 20s, 25, using film from the movie film, that film. It changed photographer's life. It changed photography. It was a total revolution, because for the first time you could move into any situation and photograph it without using artificial light and using flashlight and so on. It means you could photograph life freely. You could document events and encounters of people and so on. So it had a tremendous effect. And I still found that Leica still has that ability which a lot of other cameras don't have to the same degree, and including the quality. I mean, nowadays, of course, you have the cell phones and all those cameras, and you can do the same sort of thing. You can photograph in most places, but you don't have the same quality. You don't have the quality of lenses. So for me, it's still the most important camera. I did quite a lot of color work in the last few years. I did a few books in color, and I've gone back to black and white because I still find it stronger. There's more in it. Difficult to explain why. Color is always a sort of chocolate box. To me, it doesn't. I mean, some photographers produce wonderful color pictures. So maybe I should try some more. I never thought of that. I just photograph people. I don't go out to photograph what you call well-known or famous people. I'm just interested in people. What I like to do is we're living in a near a Spanish village called Barsh, and I'm going to have a small exhibition there of the people. And I find those people very interesting, and I like to do some portraits of the people in the little village, of their faces, to see their faces, their personality and so on. But I don't think that and then necessarily go out and film. There are some photographers, some people, when they study photography, the first thing they do is they write letters to maybe famous people or famous sportsmen or famous this, and tell them that they're a student of photography and they would like to do a book and so on. And they think through the famous people they can become famous too. But I think the most important thing to be a good photographer is to persevere, to carry on, not to stop, to carry on. Also, maybe something interesting is you run out of money, you can't afford to buy film or cameras or whatever equipment, or you can't pay your rent. Now a lot of people, they then go and work in a restaurant or work in a bar or work on a building site. I didn't do that. I carried on taking pictures commercially. Then I photographed weddings, and I photographed I went to a dance and photographed the people at the dance and then sent them pictures. I carried on trying to do earn my living out of photography in whatever way, wherever I could make some money. So I think it's, for me, and I think it's important to not to be snobbish and say, I don't take wedding pictures, I'm too good for that. That's nonsense, you see. And I used to do work for studios and took family photographs and photographed babies and so on. And if anybody comes to me and says, would you please photograph my baby, I photograph their baby. Do you see what I mean? And of course nowadays I won't charge them for it, but when I was really short of money, I made some money out of it. And you make people happy too. If you photograph people for themselves, you make them happy. And that's nice too. Eugene Smith. He's an American photographer, and he photographed. He went to Japan. I think he had a Japanese wife, and he went to Japan, and he found that there are some fishermen in a fishing village. They were all getting children which were very born very distorted. Something was seriously wrong with them, and they found that there was a factory nearby and there was mercury in the water. And he started a campaign and took pictures, and then the factory or somebody started beating him up, and they almost killed him and made him very sick. And he was a very great photographer. I think that photography, I'll give you an example. Photography is about recording the past, the present into the past. And if I photograph you now, and then 10 minutes later I show you the picture, that's history. That means I record the present for history. And there's no question about it. For photography, it's instant. So it's that particular moment, to select that particular instant moment. That is really the necessity for you to get right. And once you got the moment, you made a piece of history. Photography is about the history, the background, what happened, why it happened, and of course the memory. It is a memory. But I think the Latin countries and France are much more conscious about photography. They're more visually conscious, whereas the northern countries are too literate. They don't look anymore. And then when I was in southern Spain, I used to paint in the country with an easel. I used to paint, and I had two little boys. They sat behind me and watched me and discussed what I was painting, this and that, and then suddenly they disappeared. And I looked at my time; it was 1 o'clock, and it disappeared. Okay, so I went on painting, and then an hour later they were back again. They had gone home for lunch, and they were back. Now you wouldn't get kids in England or in Germany sitting and watching you painting and taking an interest in you painting. Do you see what I mean? There is a definite unconscious genetic thing about the language or the environment and understanding of the visuals, where they can see. So that's more or less what I'm trying to say. Well, I was in an air raid shelter in Berlin, and I had a tiny little Instamatic sort of camera. It was a small little thing they made in those days. People don't even remember these cameras. They were very small. And in the air raid shelter, I took a picture of the people at the air raid shelter. And I was 11 years old in 1942. And there were a few bombs falling, but it wasn't very serious bombing at that time. That started later. And there was somebody playing the piano accordion, and they had a case of beer. I had my first bottle of beer, and I took some pictures. And I got one of the pictures in the book here. That was my first picture. Well, I think it's easier. That's the thing. I think in a way it is better, yes. Now, I didn't think so 5-10 years ago. I still got my darkroom in here, I still do some darkroom work, and I have all my negatives and make prints and so on. What I like to do is I'm going to do an exhibition about Barsh to photograph the faces there, portraits. I'm doing a book on Spain. I finished it, but I've got a big problem getting it published because nobody's got money. And I'm doing a book called The Europeans. I've put it together, and I'm also beginning to look for a publisher, which is always very difficult. But it's about the Europeans.